Okay, seems to be better now. Okay, great. Sorry. Okay, so echo's gone. I'm Gabrielle Lifton, the editor of Landscape News. And today we're discussing the ongoing crisis that isn't the pandemic, that being wildfires. It's been the worst recorded year for fires in many regions already, with more land burned and carbon released in California and Siberia than ever before, more hotspots in the Amazon, and fire seasons lengthened by an average of 19%. The severity of fires is of course heightened by climate change and warmer temperatures, but a recent report from the World Wildlife Fund says that humans are responsible for 75% of all wildfires. So what are we doing to stop them? Because there's so much to discuss about this year's wildfires, we're breaking them up into two GLF lives. Today's discussion will focus on fires in Russia and Siberia, Indonesia, and Australia. And the second part on Thursday will discuss the Amazon and the west coast of the United States. So welcome to today's speakers. From Greenpeace Russia, we have Anton Beneslavskiy, who has been not only researching wildfires in his region, but also training firefighters and fighting them himself for more than a decade. From Indonesia, we have Daniel Murdiyarso, who's a principal scientist at the Center for International Forestry Research. And he's more or less a living library on tropical peatlands, which is where Indonesia's fires occur. So he's really an expert on understanding fires in those ecosystems. And from Australia, we have Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick, who's a climate scientist and future fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and who is also an expert on Australia's bushfires. So to start off this conversation, I just want to go around and hear about what's happening right now in your regions with wildfires, perhaps what's happened a bit in the lead up to this moment and what you expect in the months to come. So let's start with you, Anton.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everyone. And please check if your microphones are off, otherwise I hear the strong echo.
Anton, can you check to make sure you don't have two windows open as well?
No, I have only one tab open. Okay.
Okay.
The current situation in Russia is that we go into the end of the fire season, and this fire season is quite longer than it's usually has to be. We still have grass fires in the plains of southern European part of our country and some southern parts of Siberia. But we expect that till the end of November, the last fires will be put off with the weather. So we still have winter with all the climate change, but it became shorter. And it is very hard to predict what will happen next year. In our country, it depends on how the winter looks like. So once we see the winter development, amount of snow, the average temperatures, we can predict what would happen. But what we could say that last few years in a row, we have quite a huge amount of fires happening. So maybe this or that year would not be a record year, but it would be definitely quite destructive.
Okay, thank you. And let's go to you, Daniel. What's the situation in Indonesia?
Well, this year we have much less fire compared with 2019. So we are lucky. And yes, most fire are human induced. So it's very important to think about how to work with people. So in general, the occurrence of fire is also consistent with the drought condition, which is driven by a large-scale connection of the El Nino especially El Nino, what we call 3.4, and that's somewhere in the Western Pacific, which is very small, very low, not negative. And at the same time, the other global process is called Indian Ocean Dipole Mode, which is more positive, which is good, or close to neutral, and more negative and close to neutral. So we are safe. And the prediction for next year is still not clear yet, but now we are entering the La Nina. So it's September, usually it's very hot and dry. Now it's entering October, it's already wet in most places. So La Nina is coming earlier, and we didn't have any El Nino this year. So yeah, again, working with people for next year is very important, how to prevent rather than to fight or suppress fire.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's good to hear that this year isn't looking as devastating as last, and thank you for explaining the weather patterns a bit. Sarah, to you.
Yep, sure. Yeah, so the situation is somewhat similar here in Australia. I think this time last year, our bushfire season had already well and truly started on the East Coast, and that was in part due to climate change, in part due to an extreme positive IOD, and also a record drought that we've been experiencing on this side of the country. Thankfully, because we're having this La Nina start up, we've actually had above average rainfall over the east coast of Australia. So that's, I wouldn't say it's formally broken the drought, but we have received a lot more rainfall. So therefore, there's a lot less dry fuel ready to burn, and we haven't had as much extreme heat either. I guess, coming from a non-climate side, I think there's still a lot of people in Australia who are very cautious going into this summer. What happened here last year was nothing short of catastrophic, and it really ruffled a lot of people, and it was very very scary being here. So I think a lot of people, just generally speaking, are quite cautious, but at least in terms of the climate outlook, it's not looking so bad anyway.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned weather patterns and climatic effects, but the World Wildlife Fund's report that's saying that 75% of fires are caused by humans. Daniel, could you explain a bit what you think are some human actions, whether that's land use change for agriculture or starting fires for slash and burn, or what are some of the human caused actions that can lead to such fire spread?
Various these days, especially if you're looking at the map, what's happened with the land development. So when you're talking about the human-induced thing, it must be related to land development, converting forests or peatland or peat swamp forests into something else, big and small. So certainly this is very important, especially to work with local government, local community, and also issuance of permits and things like that. So there is no natural fire happening so far as I understand. Is most of them are lit by people.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, back to you. What are your thoughts on human-induced fires?
Yeah, so that might be the case in Indonesia, but here, especially last season, most of the fires are actually caused by lightning strikes. So a lot of our fires are actually started by dry lightning. Some of them are started by electricity faults and people just doing the wrong thing and deliberately lighting fires for no good reason. So I guess it depends where you are regionally. Obviously, for a fire to occur, you must have an ignition factor, whether that's a human ignition factor or a natural factor. And then it's how climate change comes into the picture is controlling the fire weather conditions. I mean, you can have the worst bushfire day on record, but it means nothing if a fire isn't lit. It's priming the conditions, not necessarily starting the fire itself. But I guess in Australia, some of the fires are started by arsonists, but we also get quite a lot started by natural causes such as lightning strikes. So it is a regionally dependent thing, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And Anton, what's the situation in Russia? What's the effect of humans on the landscapes that are burning in Russia and Siberia?
In Russia, we count 9 of 10 fires are started by this or that human activity. It could be either negligence in many cases, or it could be intentional burning. which perceived by the burners as legal, but it is not legal because of the legislation. And the smallest part are arsonists, the people who make a criminal arson. The issue is that not only ignition depends on the human, but the forests, for example, in Siberia, are very much human impacted. They are cut. They have a clear-cut patches in them which regrowth with the grass. Roads built through the forest which decrease the ability of forest to resist to the fire. So what happens is that even if we have a dry lightning, like we have this August, I was on a firefighting mission in Ural Mountains, and this fire was started with dry lightning, for example. But still, humans impact the landscape itself. It could be more flammable, it could be less resistant. So these both factors is that in Siberia, a lot of fires are started on abandoned agricultural fields as the way to clean them, so nobody control them, and the weather is changing, which is more dry and windy, let this fire spread more intensively, and then forests are not so resistant to these fires that when fire hits the forest goes on flames. Naturally, the taiga would burn very slowly on the surface once in a few decades. Now we witness a lot of fires coming into the forest much more frequently, and that convert this forest into the shrubland. Shrubland is less resistant. Shrubland will burn even more frequently, and then it will convert to the grassland, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for explaining that. Another thing that I found really interesting is the lengthening of fire seasons and how they're just getting 19% longer, which means that fire seasons around the world are going to start overlapping more. What does this mean for resources and political action in terms of fighting fires when one country is helping another country, but then they're also trying to control the fires on their own landscapes that are going beyond their capacity? How is this going to affect leadership and allocation of resources? Perhaps, Sarah, we can start with you.
Yeah, look, this is a very real issue. This happened last season in Australia. Our bushfire season overlapped with the West US wildfire season. And this happens when we have a bad season. We get people coming in from America and Canada, and they're water bombing jets and everything, and vice versa. When they have a bad season, we send people over there. We can't do that so much if there's overlapping fire seasons. Those resources are stretched. So, you know, there becomes a huge political problem. Do our governments invest more money into building up these services so we can fight fires reliably and not have to bring people in from overseas? And that has to go both ways, not just the Australian government, but the American government have to do the same. So it's changing the nature of how we fight these fires and with what resources. No doubt that's going to happen again. Of course, the US has seen some horrible wildfires this year. It perhaps may be that our seasons don't really overlap this year, but it will undoubtedly happen again in the future. It's not just a one-off situation. So we really do have to rethink how we fight these fires, both collectively and separately as different countries.
Anton, back to you. So you responded quite strongly, it seemed, to the fires that happened in Siberia and Russia earlier this year, and he sent in military forces to help fight the fires immediately. Was this strong enough of a response, do you think?
Let's be honest. The moment when government deploy military to fight fires, mostly that's the sign that they failed up, let's say. Military are not trained. It's just massive amount of people with shovels or other tools to show that we're still doing something. And firefighting is the very professional job. It requires special trainings and so on. And what happened is that these fires last year became a scandal. The smoke came into the big Siberian cities. That's why governments start to do everything to show that they still care. They did not care the year before, and they did not care this year because there was no smoke in the big Siberian cities. So what is important to mention that the later we react to the fires in each country of this world, the more resources we would need to deploy. The problem that the existing policies will involve foreign support, will involve international cooperation only when it is a disaster. Before that, governments always think, if I bring some people from abroad, would I show that I'm not so much prepared as I should be? Would my taxpayers and voters think that I'm not so competent? So let's wait till it will be a disaster when it will be justified. I can say that I can bet a lot of firefighters would say there are golden 45 minutes since the fire has begun when it's easy to suppress it. And it's better to invest in the ability to do this than to invest in military to be deployed in hundreds when the fire is already unmanageable.
And what has your experience been as a firefighter on the ground? Can you give us a glimpse into what that's like?
If we speak about, for example, forest fires in Russia, previously, if you look at the trainings which were given and the statistics that we have, the vast majority of forest fires that the Russian forest firefighter will face would be low or medium intensity ground fires, when the fire is going on the surface with a low level vegetation is burning and the big mature trees are not very much damaged. There was a rare cases of destructive ground fires in a very specific conditions. Now what we see that even the surface fires became more intensive. It became a real problem to fight them. It is more chances the forest will be burned from the bottom to the top, with the ground fires consuming large amounts of forest on kilometers and kilometers away. What that means that it's that the whole combination of strategy and tactics should be changed, and the time when the small group of foot troops can manage the fire shortened. Previously, it could be few days when a group of 5 up to 10 firefighters could manage a fire. Now it could be one day or even few hours, and then you need to increase capacity exponentially. So what happens is that we have a longer fire season, so we have the pressure on a firefighting resources much higher than previous years. And also each day of this fire season is more intensive. So each day we would need more resources than previously. And that breaks up all the planning, which was actual few years ago now, and it's totally doesn't fit to the situation.
Thank you, Anton. Daniel, let's go back to you and what's happening in Indonesia. So 2015 was one of the worst years ever for fires in Indonesia. The haze spread and caused deaths throughout the region. Last year was quite bad as well, but you said at the start of this conversation that this year isn't looking like it's going to be quite as devastating. So President Joko Widodo has put a lot of pressure on his cabinet members to take action against fires in the past. Is the pressure being lifted this year because the conditions don't seem to be as bad, or is there still a lot of action being taken at the political level to keep working to reduce peatland fires in Indonesia and manage them better in future seasons? Please unmute your mic. Daniel, I believe you're still muted, so we can't hear you.
No, it's unmuted.
There we go. Great.
Okay. Right. So, yes, it was warned that this year everybody has to be very ready to fight fire at whatever cost, especially in the region. But as things are getting relaxed in terms of climate condition, the drought and everything, and at the same time, the COVID kind of pressure arrived in February, March. So I think most of the attention shifted towards that, and I believe the budget also. So this is a blessing that a fire did not happen, and the COVID can be handled more seriously. In fact, it is handled by the same agency centrally. So I could not imagine if fire happened and they have a huge task to handle at the same time. But in that context, I think this relaxing, if you wish, time can be a lesson also that fire prevention is much more important than fire suppression. So if centralized budget for fire fighting can be deployed for regional enhancing the capacity of the region, that would be a long-lasting thing to do. And as Anton said, this capacity is varied across the region, so it's very important to have a capacity built and regionally centered kind of activities, so that in the long run, the central government no need to be panicking if things happen at the regional level, because it's so expensive to fight fire, and the mode is always hit and run, and things happen again if it happens. And so building the capacity is a long-lasting thing, given that it is handled by the same agency centrally.
And I want to ask a follow-up question on that about fire prevention rather than firefighting, because especially in Indonesia and Siberia and Russia as well, where it's peatland landscapes, especially, so waterlogged ground, and there seems to be sort of a vicious feedback loop happening where global warming will dry out the ground, which makes it easier to burn. So then it burns, which releases carbon, which heightens the global temperature, which makes it dry even more. So when we have these cycles working against us, what can we do to prevent fires?
Right. So if one wants to prioritize the region, there are 11 provinces. So the governance system is, we have central government and provincial government. They have the right and authority to handle things, including the natural resources. So these 11 provinces are the provinces with peatland. So I think the capacity of these provinces need to be enhanced substantially, especially with peatland fire, which is quite different with forest or surface fire. It's not flaming. It's not, surface kind of treatment to do. It can be long-lasting one because it's underneath the ground and it's smoldering, and that will give more devastating effect on human health, as well as, other activities, including transportation, navigation, and things like that. So the feedback loop of the warming climate really is something that need to be factored in, because that's not only making the ground drier or the ecosystem drier, but also, especially on peatland, if you have peat drain, that's the beginning of the disaster. And if you want to make it wet and weather is not permitting, that's also a problem. So asking about what to do, I think the conserved or protected areas should be more and more protected, and enforcement is needed. And then the degraded one, which is already less vegetation but drier ground, and it's just like litter actually, but it's very deep, and that's a very potential combustion material to be burned.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions coming in from the audience. So we'll get to those in just a moment. But first, I want to ask you a similar question, Sarah, because this is your research background as well. But what can we really do to be preventing fires better than we are?
Yeah, look, there's a few good things we can do. And again, it is regionally dependent. We have a very different ecosystem here in Australia where the trees are highly flammable. So around, where I live and, in the more rural areas, we can do things to reduce the fire load of our houses. So simple things like clearing gutters, making sure we've got a good fire break, making sure that in the event of a fire agencies can access our land, making sure we've got solid water supplies such as tanks or pools or something like that to help when there is a fire. It is a lot harder to keep our landscape moist and wet. That's a bit difficult. We are quite a dry continent, but they're the things you can do every day. You can have a fire plan. That's a massive push here, that you have a plan to escape a lot earlier than what has happened in the past if a fire does occur. But ultimately, climate change is a picture of the fire landscape now. We've been saying that for, a couple of decades, and we knew that around about now, that's when we'd start to see the impact of climate change on bushfires. So in terms of long-term strategies, we've got to just do more than adapt. We need to mitigate. That is the bottom line. Of course, we can have fires without climate change. All of these regions have experienced fires without climate change, but they're going to get worse. We're going to see more of these crown fires and pyrocumulonimbus fires that we've started to see more of here in Australia. And these seasons are getting longer and the fires are getting more intense. And that's very strongly linked with climate change. So that's part of the bigger picture, is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Absolutely. Thank you. So one of the questions from the audience touches on something you just said and something Anton mentioned before as well. Florian from Austria is asking, is the fire type changing in your regions? For example, are there more ground fires or less ground fires as opposed to crown fires? How is this really presenting itself in your regions? So Sarah, you just touched on that, Anton as well, but if any of you would like to add a bit more, and Daniel, maybe you want to say something as well, feel free to just chime in as you wish.
Look, I'll just say here that certainly in Australia, we're seeing more of these fires that interact with the atmosphere and form their own weather system. They're the pyrocumulonimbus fires, or PCB fires. And they're a rare event of an extreme. So they're, they used to be very rare, but now we've seen them in our most intense bushfire season. So 2009 was another bad season. We see a lot more of these PCB events. And these are the ones that burn everything, are really intense. They spread so quickly and cause a lot of loss of life. And not only are we seeing more of them historically, but the sort of weather that's conducive to these events is showing increases due to climate change. So we're seeing more of them now, and we're going to see even more of them in the future. So yeah, the types of fires that we're seeing here are becoming these super fires, not just the normal fires, if you will, definitely.
Super fires, gosh.
I could add one aspect which is relevant for the big areas, because Siberia is quite a large region, and more to the north it's less fragmented, I would say. So the fire can spread over the big areas. What happens is, due to the climate change, to dry and hotter and windy weather, more intensive fires happens on the larger patches. What does that mean? That it reduces the possibility of regrowth. The plants, the trees which could replant the burnt area, now have the bigger space to replant and less trees standing. So what happens is that the previous species which existed till the extreme fire passes the area now cannot produce enough seeds to replant this area. So this area would lose the previous species composition and it would be replaced with another one. What happened later is that the Siberian hydro system, as a swamp and forest hydro system, we do not have a lot of mountains for the melting snow to create rivers. Our rivers are mostly goes from swamps. So once the forest is destroyed by the fire, the swamps becomes drier and the smaller rivers dies. So what we witnessed last few years is that some of the bigger Siberian rivers had much less water than previously. And also we have floods because previously forests were regulating the hydrocycling in these areas, now there is no forest to consume so much water in the spring or in the early summer, so the floods appear in the areas they never happened before because there is no forests to regulate this. And all this starts the whole domino effect of the species disappear. Big mammals went away because the large areas are destroyed and they have no food in their previous habitat. And that's the process which is very hard to stop, because you can replant a few hectares with a human hands, maybe 100, but we have millions of hectares burned, and among them hundreds or even million hectares of totally destroyed forest.
Yeah. In the Indonesian context, fire regime is changing, but from different perspective. It's very much driven by the political economy rather than the fire characteristic itself. So back in 1997, the mega fire, which was also different with the 1983 fire, the big fire, was very much driven by large-scale land conversion or forest conversion. And then in the mid-2006, 2007, it's kind of mixed between big and small. And I think it's related to the questions of, I think it's Tony in the chat room. What is the proportion between large-scale and small-scale land conversion? And the more recent one, I think it's quite mixed, but very much dominated by small, but many small scale, and more professional, small but more professional in terms of the use of equipment and things like that. So the implication for that is really the way we suppress or fight fire that was used in 1997 or early 2000 is different with what we should be doing in the next fire season. So one have to map what is the political economy, what is driving all these land use changes, and that's very important to consider before we go out and fight fires.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So policy around land use change, is that your point? Okay.
Yeah.
There's a question from, let's see, Marilyn Micheni, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, who's asking a question about something Anton touched on, which is how do we restore landscapes once they've been completely burned by fires, and especially as the soil is changing, the water systems are changing, the climate is changing. How does this affect landscape restoration? And maybe we can take this in an optimistic way. Have any of you seen good examples of how to restore landscapes after mass fires? Or do you have any thoughts on how to do so best? Maybe Daniel, would you like to start with this?
Yeah, well, most of the fire here in Indonesia are related to peatland, which used to be considered as marginal land, unfortunately, and it contains huge biodiversity. So biologically diverse peatland is suffer a lot. So when you are talking about restoration, one thing need to do is to re-wet them, because it's no longer peatland if it is dry. So re-wetting is a massive work and very expensive. And then put the vegetation, especially native vegetation, back and to attract, fauna. Also the native one. So it's been lost quite a lot. And even before we do not know yet exactly how many and how much they are worth for the environment. So I think this is very much underscored in terms of restoration, about the wealth and health of the biodiversity. So the most visible one is really re-wetting. That's the most immediate thing need to be done at large scale kind of size.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, in Australia's landscapes, how do we restore the lands that have been devastated by bushfires?
This is a really good question. I don't really. So, on one side of the coin, our vegetation is quite used to being burnt. Fire regimes have been in practice here for tens of thousands of years by the Aboriginal people of the land. They use fire management within the vegetation structure for a very, very, very long time before white settlement. So consequently, a lot of the species here have adapted to this fire regime, and they even after some of these catastrophic fires we've seen in recent months, they're starting to regenerate by themselves. So even the plants that were burnt to a crisp are now showing signs of the vegetation coming back. So that's a positive thing, that even after all of these horrible events, our ecosystems will come back to a certain extent. But there's not a lot going on in terms of regenerating the animal life and the soil. I really don't have a strong answer about what's going on in Australia. Sure, there'd be little groups and little volunteer groups that are going to do these projects, but there's certainly not a big coordinated effort from the state or federal government. Certainly not in terms of regeneration anyway. And especially with the fires that we've just had here on the East Coast, it was so unprecedented that I don't think people have the answers to how do we completely bring the ecosystems back to normal, or if we can. There's reports that over 1 billion animals alone were killed in the fires. How do we bring that back, and how do we bring it back quickly before the next fires occur? Most people think that we may not even be able to do that to that full extent.
Mm-hmm. It's a new reality.
Yeah.
Anton, in Russia and Siberia, these landscapes you were talking about and the changing of the floods and the river systems, how is that affecting restoration efforts, if there are any at all?
Their governmental program of forest restoration, no matter what was the reason of the forest loss, fire or buckkill or clear cut, they should be restored. We work with the government and we propose more sophisticated way to replace forest, especially in the European part of the country where there is no so much business forest. There were no so much forests which are used for logging. So to replace the previously monocultural forests created in Russian Empire with a mixed forest which are more resistant to bugs, to diseases, and to fires. The second point is that what we claim government to do is to allow farmers to grow forests on their lands. A lot of lands were used in Soviet Union for agriculture because it was quite an obsolete way of doing growing crops. We grew a lot with a very inefficient way in the Soviet Union. Today, in nowadays, farming is much more effective on a lower areas. So a lot of abandoned agricultural lands could be converted into forest back, or to the forest plantations, and it will remove the logging companies from the natural forests back to the areas which already are not so valuable from the natural perspective. What is important is that it is almost impossible to restore a natural forest, a virgin forest. It's a very complicated system which depends on climate, depends on water system in this area. It is too complicated for us to recreate it. And more of that, with the climate change, it could be impossible to recreate, to restore something that existed 100 years ago, because the climate is totally different and the whole situation is totally different. So what we are working with and what is going slowly forward is the concept that we should grow as much forests as possible on agricultural lands to remove logging companies from intact forests and let the intact forests grow up and replant the areas around them in a natural way. In this case, we will remove humans from intact forests. So if 9 of 10 fires happens due to human activities, we will remove 9 of 10 ignitions from the intact forests to the agricultural lands, which has better logistics, which are fragmented, which are guarded, which are used for the business. That's why we expect that the fires in these lands would be suppressed on the earlier stage. And that will allow intact forest landscapes to come to some natural and stable fire regime themselves. But what we do not expect, that we can come back 200 years ago. It would not happen until the climate will come back to this status of 200 years ago.
Thank you for that. I'll direct one more question at Daniel and then follow that with a question for you all. Daniel, this one to you. We have a question from Murdiyarso about President Widodo's plans basically to help achieve food security through food estates and expanding agriculture into some of these peatland areas. How do you see the balance between need for agriculture expansion and protection of these ecosystems that are also very prone to fires? And please don't forget to unmute your mic.
Is that okay?
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yeah, as long as they can avoid peatland, it should be okay, because it is not very productive land anyway. So you need a lot of input. It's very expensive to grow rice on peatland. So if the idea is to get large area, single unit of land, there should be somewhere else with mineral soil to do that as well. So, and then in the context of food security, I do not think that's the only answer to secure the provision of food. The intensification of the existing land is not done optimally, so we can do that as well. So I don't know. My personal opinion is that it's not very urgent to expand, especially if the expansion towards peatland cannot be avoided. And that's always the case. You know, if things leaking in different area than it was planned, that's very difficult to control. And out of that would be fire related cases, because you need to clear up the land, and fire is always used as a tool to clean it up. And again, maybe, yeah, deja vu.
Great, thank you. I think you can hear children sing at a mosque nearby or something like that. Okay, just some background noise there. Okay, so the last question, and this comes from one of our listeners, Maria, but I'll expand on it a bit. But it's about priority of action. So in your opinions, the actions you would like to see from the government and from communities as well, in terms of investing in prevention, in investing in restoration, investing in spread of knowledge, and investing in actual firefighting. What do you think should be the priorities of these actions taken? And we can go around, starting with you, Sarah.
Climate change and reducing our emissions being one major factor. It's certainly not the only factor here in Australia. Our bushfire firefighting effort mainly comes from volunteers, and that's woefully underfunded. This happens at a state level, so there's different firefighting agencies depending on which state you live in, and the federal government tends to fob it off to the state level, and there's kind of this disconnect of where the funding should come from and how much should they get, and and then there's this whole thing about donations and if they should receive public donations as well. So I personally believe that not only do we need to think about the long term, which is where climate change comes into it, but we need to have the most appropriate and cutting edge tools and resources available to help us in the interim. And at the moment, we simply don't have that in Australia. Not only in terms of funding, so better trucks, better clothing, that sort of thing, but also the mental health of the firefighters here as well, and the sheer number of them. We need such a large injection of that sort of resources here in Australia. And I guess, you know, it's also important that the public are better educated. Since our fire season in 2009, there's been this huge push to be prepared, be fire ready. There's, you know, you must have a fire plan if you live in a fire prone area. So people are more aware, but obviously not enough given the last fire season that we've had. So we do need to push that education factor and what you need to do in a fire and how early you need to respond, and also how you need to prepare your property. But certainly I think for me, my view here is, you know, the long term is mitigating, and in the short term we need to adapt with better firefighter resources.
Thank you. Definitely a new reality for citizens. Anton, to you.
So it was said a few times here that prevention is important, and we need to revisit our strategies of prevention, because it's, in many cases, it's quite technical. Let's burn this tribe or this area to reduce fuel. Let's put a sign. Let's put a banner. The greatest example is Smokey Bear in the US. The issue is that globally, main part of fires and the vegetation belong to agriculture in this or that way. And that's an economical question. So the economy should drive off burnings which are not 100% useful, which are used as obsolete but cheap way to clean lands, for example. So that should be removed. We should remove all the fire intervention into nature which are not 100% necessary or justified by this or that very practical goal. Otherwise, the amount of ignitions would be so high that none of prevention or none of response system will manage it. Currently, the fight of firefighters against fires in the countries with the big amounts of fires look like a heroic stand till the rain comes down. That happens in my country, that happens in many other countries. We fight fires, we do not sleep, we got post-traumatic stress disorder, and we wait for the rain. So we just keep it. We do not fight it. We do not suppress it. We keep it until the rain comes. So what is important is to change the economy and remove fire as much as possible from economy, at least. It is important to invest in prevention and explaining people that you should not introduce fire if it is not scientifically proven. We should find fires on the very early stage and suppress them before they come back. And what is important, I think, is to acknowledge that the fires in Australia, for example, is not just a TV show for people in Europe or Russia. It's our problem too, because it's part of the climate change. The fires in Brazil also not just an event in Brazil. The fires in Indonesia is not just an event in Indonesia. And that means that the global community is responsible and interested in supporting countries which are not capable to manage fires in their regions, to help them to do this, as well as we do with epidemic situations, as well as we do with hunger and so on.
Thank you. Those were some really powerful points about the global community tackling these together. And then something that I also heard from you and Sarah both, which is a broader conversation for a different time, is investing in the firefighters themselves and their mental health and the effects that it has on the people dealing with these on the front lines. So thank you for sharing that. And then Daniel will give you the last words and then we'll close out here. And please unmute.
Involving people, local community are key, very key. And I think the way we do it should be different. You know, most of the time then we are talking about local involvement is to involve them in fighting fire, but without knowing what is it for. So a new entry point might be a device here in terms of health. So if the awareness about the impact of fire and haze on the health is understood enough by the local people, that will be a very powerful means of campaigning and involving them in a real sense, because they are the one who are affected first, in the first place, the local people close to the fire. Let alone if you're talking about carcinogenic compound, only local people are affected, not because this substance does not fly too far away. So if this kind of information is in their mind, this will be a very powerful tool why they are involved, not just to get paid or training or anything, but this is their really their daily life. So my concern is that fire is a permanent, almost permanent problem, regular, and then I think government is trying to look for permanent solution. My worry is that the permanent solution is almost leaning towards technology, and well, technology is very important to fight to get rid of this, but these people, the ground, the problem on the ground need to be engineered as well. So if this understanding about the impact on health is good, well enough to understand, and that would be one thing to involve local people. And the permanent solution should not only be technology, because there is a trend now to use weather modification as permanent solution, and I'm worried about that. Rainmaking, that's not solution. It's just temporary kind of symptomatic cure, if you wish, and if things come again, then you have to do the same thing, maybe more expensive. So the permanent solution is really working with people and make them understand so that they can get prepared themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that last message of empowering local communities. That's so important. And thank you to everyone in the audience for listening to this GLF Live and joining us and contributing your great questions. I learned so much. I hope you did too. We have our next GLF Live on Thursday about the fires in the Amazon and the west coast of the United States. We hope that you'll join us for that as well. We have 2 great speakers. You can find more on Landscape News about that event. And thank you once again to Daniel, Anton, and Sarah for your time and your valuable contributions. We so appreciate you joining us today. So wish you well, and we'll see you next time on GLF Live.
Thank you. Bye.